Welcome to Sleepy Classic Tales. Today we begin a story that is told quietly and yet develops an immense tension. The Horla by Guy de Maupassant, first published in 1887. A tale about perception, doubt, and the fear of no longer being alone. Part 1. The narrator leads a calm, orderly life. He lives alone in a house on the banks of the Seine, surrounded by nature, light, and silence. Everything appears harmonious, almost idyllic. He is healthy, content, without worries. At least, he believes so. In his diary, he describes this peace with great precision. He loves the clear mornings, the steady flow of the river, the reliability of his daily routine. Nothing suggests that anything might fall out of balance. Yet one day he notices a change. Not dramatic, not obvious, more a feeling. A slight unease he cannot classify. He sleeps poorly, wakes exhausted without knowing why. It is as though someone has taken his rest without leaving traces. At first he does not attach great importance to it. He explains it rationally. Weather, nerves, perhaps a minor illness. He is educated, reasonable, not prone to fantasies. He prides himself on that. But the strange sensations return. He feels observed without seeing anything. He senses a presence in the room, although he is alone. It is not a concrete thought, more a bodily awareness, as if something invisible stood between him and the world. A particularly disturbing moment occurs at night. He wakes and feels as though someone is standing over him. He cannot move, cannot speak. The air seems heavy, almost oppressive. Only after a few seconds does the state dissolve, and he lies alone in the darkness again. The next morning he tries to dismiss the incident. He laughs at himself, speaks of a dream, of imagination. Yet doubt has been planted. And he begins to look more closely. He observes his body, his strength, his thoughts. He realizes that he is changing. Not abruptly, but gradually, as though he were losing something without knowing what. Most unsettling is the realization that this change does not seem to be stoppable. For now, he still clings to reason. For now, he believes he can explain everything. But inside him, a question grows that he does not want to ask. What if something is there that cannot be seen, and yet acts? And with this thought, something begins that he will soon no longer be able to control. The narrator tries to continue his life unchanged. He rises, follows his habits, receives visitors, takes excursions. Outwardly, everything appears normal. But inwardly, something has shifted. The certainty with which he once thought and felt is no longer there. More and more often, he wakes exhausted. His sleep is restless, interrupted by moments in which he feels paralyzed. He is convinced that something drains his strength at night. Not symbolically, quite literally, as if something feeds on him while he is defenseless. One observation disturbs him especially. Water and milk he places on the table in the evening are empty in the morning. At first he believes in carelessness, but the more often it happens, the less plausible this explanation seems. He begins to measure carefully, to control, to record. The results are clear. Something drinks these liquids, and he is alone in the house. The narrator reacts as he would expect of himself, rationally. He seeks medical advice, reads scientific texts, engages with contemporary findings about nervous disturbances, sleep disturbances, and hallucinations. For a moment, he believes he has found an explanation. But the relief does not last long. The sensation of a presence returns, that feeling of not being alone, though no one is there. It is not a sound, not a shadow, rather a pressure on perception, as though something stood between him and the world and slightly distorted it. He begins to mistrust himself. Not in panic, but cautiously. He checks his thoughts, questions his conclusions, controls his memory. And precisely this intensifies the uncertainty. The more closely he looks, the less support he finds. In his diary, tone and content begin to change. The entries grow longer, more strained, repetitive. He tries to impose order on his observations, as if the incomprehensible could be banished in this way. Yet his language betrays him. Doubts slip in, between sentences, between explanations. A thought begins to take shape, one he still does not dare to speak aloud, that there might be things beyond human perception. Not because they do not exist, but because we are not made to see them. This idea frightens him deeply, for it calls into question everything he has trusted until now: senses, reason, certainties. If something invisible can act without being recognized, what then does security mean? He still tries to push this idea back, but it is now there, and it can no longer be banished from his mind. The narrator begins to place his experiences into a broader context. He reads reports, newspaper articles, scientific treatises. He is particularly fascinated by the notion that humanity might not be the final link in creation, that there could be beings superior to us, just as we are superior to animals. This thought does not let him go. He wonders whether humans might merely be an intermediate form, whether it is possible that on Earth, or somewhere else, a new species has developed, invisible to our senses yet real in its effects, a species that uses us without our noticing. Slowly, he gives this something a name: the Horla. Not because he knows it, but because he must name it. The name gives form to the intangible, a place within thought. And yet, that very act makes everything more threatening. For what has a name begins to exist. The narrator now observes himself with new attentiveness. He notes every weakness, every fatigue, every change of will. He finds that his thoughts are sometimes no longer entirely his own, that decisions come harder, that he does things without later remembering the resolve. A particularly frightening moment occurs when he stands before a mirror. For an instant he believes he cannot see his reflection. It is as though something stands between him and the reflective surface, something that occupies his place without being visible. The moment passes, but the impression remains. From then on, he feels not only observed, but dominated, as though the Horla has access to his body, to his mind, not through force, but through proximity, through a presence that permits no resistance. At the same time, a sense of helplessness grows. If the Horla exists, then he is at its mercy. If it does not exist, then he himself is lost. Both possibilities are unbearable. He wavers between insight and madness, between the desire to recognize the truth and the longing to dismiss everything as imagination. But the more he thinks about it, the less stability he finds. The Horla is no longer merely a suspicion. It is an explanation. And perhaps that is the most dangerous part. For an explanation gives direction to terror. The narrator is now convinced that the Horla is real, not as a vague suspicion, but as certainty. The doubts that once accompanied him recede into the background. Too many observations, too many correspondences argue against dismissing everything as imagination. He begins to orient his life around this conviction. Every action is examined, every thought questioned. He feels no longer free, but guided. Decisions seem alien to him, as though they no longer arise from his own will. What frightens him most is the realization that resistance seems hardly possible. The Horla does not force him, does not command. It acts more subtly. It influences. And precisely this invisibility makes it powerful. The narrator experiments. He tries to provoke the Horla, to prove its existence. He deliberately places objects, observes the slightest changes, examines himself. Again and again, the results confirm his worst fears. One experience shakes him deeply. He feels inwardly compelled to do things he would rather avoid. It is as though his will has lost weight, as though he were merely the shell of a man while something else assumes control. This notion robs him of sleep. He begins to see humanity as a weak being, dependent on its senses, limited in understanding. Perhaps, he thinks, the Horla is only the herald of a new order, a world in which humans are no longer at the center. At the same time, his hatred grows, not only toward the Horla but toward his own helplessness. He despises himself for being unable to act, for recognizing what happens and yet remaining exposed. In this inner division, a decision matures. If the Horla exists, then it must be destroyed. Not through discussion, not through proof, but through action. He clings to this thought like a last remnant of self-determination. For the first time in a long while, he feels something resembling control. Yet this decision brings no peace. It brings escalation. For whoever fights something invisible never knows whether he strikes the enemy or himself. The decision to act initially gives the narrator renewed strength. For the first time in weeks, he no longer feels entirely at the mercy of events. If the Horla exists, then it must follow rules. And if it follows rules, perhaps it can be deceived, confined, or destroyed. This thought becomes an obsession. The narrator begins to proceed methodically. He observes himself even more closely than before. He notes when his thoughts grow sluggish, when his will seems weaker. He records every change, every deviation, as though studying a foreign being within himself. At the same time, his conviction grows that the Horla is bound to the place, to the house, to certain rooms, to habits. This assumption gives him stability. If the Horla is part of his surroundings, then perhaps it can be fought there. He devises a plan. The plan is simple, almost brutal. He intends to trap the Horla and destroy it, leaving no possibility of escape. He prepares everything carefully, calmly, with the meticulousness of a man who believes he has nothing left to lose. In those days, he appears almost composed outwardly. Visitors notice little. He speaks clearly, moves calmly, even seems more serene than before. Yet this calm is tense. It is the result of a single, fixed idea. At night, he carries out his plan. He locks the house, checks every exit, every door, every window. Then he sets fire. Not hastily, not in panic, but deliberately. Flames spread, smoke fills the rooms. The narrator is convinced that the Horla is now trapped. As the fire blazes, he stands outside and waits. He listens. He believes he perceives movement, a struggle, a will to escape. For a moment he feels triumphant certainty. If the Horla exists, then it must die now. But immediately doubt mixes with this certainty. What if the Horla was not bound to the house? What if it has long been within himself? What if the fire has destroyed nothing but the last remnant of security? As the house stands in flames, the narrator realizes he has done something irrevocable. He has acted without being certain, and this uncertainty returns with full force. For if the Horla still exists, then it has nothing left to lose, and neither does he. After the fire, nothing remains but emptiness. The house is destroyed, the familiar place gone. The narrator stands before the ruins and feels no relief, no victory, only exhaustion. And beneath it, a gnawing question. Has anything changed? At first, he believes he senses a difference. The nights seem calmer, the pressure weaker. For a short time, he draws hope. Perhaps the Horla was indeed bound to the place. Perhaps the fire destroyed it. This thought sustains him, like a final proof that action was possible. But this hope is fragile. Soon the old sensations return, the fatigue, the feeling of not being alone, the uncertainty about whether thoughts truly arise from himself. And now something new is added. The realization that he has lost everything without gaining anything. The narrator begins to observe himself like a stranger. His reactions seem delayed, his emotions flat. It is as though he burned a part of himself with the house, or as though the Horla has now definitively taken possession of him. He rereads his diary entries. The early ones appear foreign, almost naive. The later ones frighten him. He recognizes the path he has taken, from slight unease to certainty to action, and he wonders whether this path was logical or whether it had to lead into madness. The thought does not leave him that the Horla may never have existed outside of him, that the invisible he fought was nothing other than a part of himself. Yet this explanation is equally unbearable, for it means he can no longer trust himself. What remains is a state between fear and resignation. The narrator feels weak, drained, inwardly empty. He realizes he has no proof, neither for the existence of the Horla nor for its destruction. And this uncertainty is more cruel than any clear threat. Slowly, a final, dark recognition forms. If the Horla exists, it is invincible. If it does not exist, the narrator is lost. Both possibilities lead to the same point, and that point lies closer than he wants to admit. The narrator now knows there is no escape. The events cannot be undone, the thoughts cannot be ordered. Whether the Horla is a real being or an illness of his mind matters little. What matters is that he no longer possesses control. He feels dominated. Not constantly, not clearly, but enough to destroy any certainty. His will seems fragile, his thinking unreliable. Even the decision to go on living no longer feels like his own. In his final entries, he speaks of humanity as a transition, of a time when humans are no longer masters of themselves. The Horla, whether being or idea, stands for this future, for a power that cannot be seen but can be felt, and that permits no resistance. The narrator realizes he can no longer fight, not because he gives up, but because there is no opponent one can grasp. All that remains is one final thought. If the Horla lives through humans, then the human must disappear. This realization is calm, not panicked, almost logical. He writes that he sees no other choice, that he must act before he is completely dominated, not out of courage, but out of fear of the total loss of himself. With this thought, the diary ends. What happens afterward remains unspoken, but the silence that follows is unmistakable. It leaves no doubt that the narrator has taken the only step that still seemed free to him. The Horla remains, not as a figure, not as proof, but as a question. And with that, our story for today comes to an end. A story about perception, control, and the fear of no longer being able to trust oneself. Perhaps you are now wondering, how strongly does this calm, short version differ from Maupassant's original? Why does the narrator fail despite reason, education, and the attempt to keep everything under control? And how closely is this story tied to its author's own fears of mental decline and the loss of inner security? We explore these and other questions in our accompanying book, Golden Pages, Volume 2. There we place the story in context, examine its background, and show why the Horla continues to unsettle readers today. You will find the link in the description. For today, you may simply let the story settle. Let your thoughts slowly come to rest. And if you like, we will listen together again tomorrow on Sleepy Classic Tales. Good night.